We're counting down the top 9 things we've learned about podcasting from NuVoodoo research.
This is finding number 7.
Podcast networks are the norm, but there's room for indie voices.
Very rarely I'll use Spotify in the car.
Mostly Spotify.
I use Spotify. I have an iPhone, so I use the actual podcast app.
Pretty much just solely the Apple.
On the Apple Podcasts.
There are a few that I watch on YouTube.
And I listen to her on Patreon to not have to listen to commercials.
In a recent NuVoodoo nationwide study, interviews with over 5,000 14 to 57-year-olds, sample balanced across 3 generations, yielded a universe of better than 1,600 regular podcast listeners. These are the folks who listen to podcasts for an hour or more each week and whose opinions weigh heavily in our study findings. While networks are indeed potent engines for driving podcast listening, none commands a majority of overall podcast consumption. Not quite 4 in 10 mention Spotify as their go-to for podcasts. It's strongest among Gen Z. New York Times and public media are not far behind, showing strength particularly among millennial and Gen X men. But 1 in 5 also recognize they're listening to independent voices. We cut off the long tail of smaller-known networks and publishers, but it's important to note indie-friendly Patreon in this ranking. A broad spectrum of topic areas are attractive to regular podcast listeners, but notice that not even the most popular topics come close to being saturated. There's headroom for new ideas. Around half our sample of regular podcast listeners say they're highly interested in the leading topic areas: true crime, comedy, self-help, and managing money. But notice what happens when we fade out the portions of the demand groups for each of these topics where respondents wish there were better podcasts available about that topic. We see that as much as half of the potential demand for every podcast topic area is either unmet or has room for better offerings. From a content perspective, the barrier to entry into the podcast marketplace is truly limited only by the imagination. But as aspiring podcast producers will discover in finding number 6, quality absolutely matters. See you in our next video.
NuVoodoo conducts research studies and manages marketing campaigns for podcasters.
It's easy to get in touch. Drop us a line at tellmemore@nuvoodoo.com.